Welcome everyone to the CONP podcast. My name is Paolo Leone and today I'm with Kristen Ratan, co-founder of the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation. So, Kristen, let's start. My first question is, what does openness mean for you?
Well, I think it means two different things when you're talking about society versus what we mean when we talk about, say, open research or open science. And society, it means honest. And in the context of what is open science, and I'll just use that phrase as a convenient phrase, though it's probably not broad enough, we mean transparency. And we mean availability. So I think it's important. It's probably the wrong word, but it's a little late for that. It started with open source, and then open access, and then open data, and all of these opens, and now we're sort of stuck with this term. And everybody argues as to whether it's open science or open scholarship or open research, and we can't even agree on that.
So do you think that the current society is not open?
I don't think that human nature leads us to be open at all times. I think we know very well that that would not work well. We have all learned as part of our societies that you have to hold some things back, that you have to be reserved at times, and that actually is safer and perhaps kinder. So it's challenging. You grow up as a child wondering when I should share and when I shouldn't. When should I say something and when should I not? And as you know, children also aren't born wanting to share good things. Mm-hmm. They may want to share their concerns or their anxieties or other things. So I think it's a real challenge. And I think the fact that it's playing out in research and in science is hardly surprising, given that as humans, we've not really figured this out. So what we've done is we've created constructs, and in the world of research, the current construct is not to share too readily, because bad things happen. You get scooped, or you don't get your funding, or you don't get the big paper that you need in order to get the big grant that you need in order to continue to do your research. And so we've created the construct that kind of inhibits that sharing process. And now we're stuck with that, and we're trying to figure out how to undo, which is always a challenge.
So if I understood well, you think that human beings are not necessarily open by nature?
I definitely think we're not always open.
But they need to learn how to be open in order to benefit society.
It's clear that a certain degree of transparency and a certain degree of honesty does benefit society. But you're not going to be honest with your loved ones all the time, right? You can't. So we know this in our very personal lives, that you have to temper that. Also, when it comes to research, you know that sharing results before you have any idea what they mean could be harmful even. You certainly don't want to share the results of a potential new drug with the world if you haven't tested it.
Right.
So there are good reasons to hold things back. And I think what we've done is we've created bad reasons to do the same. And then we get confused about what's the right reason to share something, to communicate something, to be open about something, and when is it not? And in our own daily lives, every day we make mistakes around this. We all know them, and we are embarrassed by them, we're horrified, and sometimes we cause pain or something. So we know that there should be a more readily understandable construct, and yet we can't really quite create it properly, because it requires pulling down and pulling apart institutions we've built up over the years. So we're working against the tide, as you always are when you're trying to create culture change.
In this scenario, what is the goal of the Coko Foundation?
So we decided to tackle the problem of open research from one corner, one angle. It is a huge system that we've built and that we've created, and you can't undo the whole thing at once. You can't change it all at once. You have to start somewhere. And after years of working in open access and other areas, I felt that we needed to rebuild from the bottom up, and that the most foundational level is the infrastructure. And so by creating open and shared infrastructure, you begin to create a new ground on which people walk. And that's why we started where we did at Coko. But we are doing that to enable and to facilitate other forms of open research, open access, open data, research integrity and reproducibility, other things that we think are good.
What do you mean by infrastructure? Can you give me an example?
Well, I think of infrastructure as being a combination of technology, standards, services that tie the technology together and make it usable. So it's a combination of those things.
Right. And do you think that thanks to these infrastructures, people collaborate differently as compared to how they collaborate in normal forms or organizations?
Yes. I think that infrastructure can make a big difference. If you think of the web, it is an infrastructure that made a big difference. And it's changed everything in terms of how we communicate. Mobile is another that's changed everything. So I think that it's a necessary but not sufficient step in creating the kind of culture change that I'd like to see happen. It's one piece of a bigger puzzle, but an important and critical one. We couldn't have imagined ourselves communicating the way we do with smartphones before they existed. So in some cases, you have a sort of chicken and egg situation where you have to put something in front of the community and say, this is an opportunity, and see if they take it. You can't force them to. And if they take it, they may not do with it what you thought. So it's one piece and an important piece, but we have to make it work with the other pieces.
Right. So, for example, in open scholarship, what is an infrastructure? Like a practical example of infrastructure
for scholarly communication?
Yeah.
It would be the platforms people use to share manuscripts and data, to publish them, the platforms that host publications like journals, the platforms and technologies that create and implement digital object identifiers that make links work on the web. There are platforms that embody standards or tools that embody a standard. And that's a really important way to make a standard turn into a reality and to turn into something that is in use constantly. So there are many, many infrastructures within the whole scholarly communication chain. So that the current infrastructures are holding that back. So when you just look at, let's take the example of journal publishing. If you take the way in which a researcher conducts their research, say they're doing that in the field or in the lab, and they're collecting data and they're collecting information, and then they're working with that information to make sense of it, and then they come up with some sense, some idea, right, of what to make of the data. They now have data, they have analyses, they may have code that is associated or methodologies, equipment, they have initial results, they have some initial conclusions, they have collaborators they've worked with. That's a whole lot of objects and things that are connected to one another. They then shove all that to the side and take out what is essentially a piece of paper, a Word document, which is a digital form of a piece of paper, and they start writing something completely new and different in a very constrained form that is the same as it's been for hundreds of years, with a little introduction and a set of methods and a set of results and a conclusion and these little sections. And then they submit that through a system that preserves the piece of paper Word document as an attachment through a peer review process that's blinded typically. And then at the end of that process, once it's gone through all of the checks and balances and months have passed by, the people who did all of that are notified that it will now be put onto the internet. So if you were going to invent a way for researchers to take all of this good stuff that they've done, all of this data and analysis and results and the code and the methods and this equipment and the people and the collaborators, and if you were going to try to invent a way for them to share that with the world, would it be this pipeline? I don't think so. We're stuck with this because it's evolved out of an old print model. So if you were going to say, let's reinvent that, let's try to take that research and get it out there as quickly as possible, because speed matters. We want it to also be complete with all of these pieces and parts visible so we can see how the work was done. We can see the connection between the data and the tools that were used to analyze it and the people that weighed in on that analysis and created conclusions out of it. We want to see who said what to whom. We even want to see the peer review process. So if you were going to reinvent all of that, you would do it in a completely different way. You'd the best tools that the web has to offer. You would bring to bear. Real-time collaboration in the browser, in the moment, using all of the different devices and tools we have today. You would track and keep all of the pieces and parts in places where you can see them all at once. And when you displayed that to somebody who needed that work, they would be able to see the full constellation of all of these objects and how they interrelated and the history of how that work evolved into the piece that you have. And you would present to that person what the current status of that same work is today. a publication is an antiquated snapshot in time. It doesn't tell you much about what the work was that went into it or the work that's happened since it was submitted. And since it takes months and sometimes years for that submission to become published, probably a lot of work has happened. So what we're doing today is taking all of that wonderful work and crumpling it up into a little weird piece of paper that gets passed around, and then we're putting that piece of paper on the internet. And I think we can do a lot better than that. And I think we have to. We're faced with challenges today that the world has never seen. We can't afford as a society to wait for people to pass bits of crumpled paper around anymore. And it's not just an ethical obligation to increase the speed and the transparency of all of this. It's also respecting the work that went into it and the data, and understanding that a researcher is entrusting this hard work in the process. And they're entrusting that publishers and institutions and libraries will hold that work and make it available and treat it with some respect. But the reality of it is we're throwing all that data into third-party solutions. We don't even know who owns them. Corporations who buying each other at such a rapid rate, nobody understands anymore who owns the data. And as we know from the things like Facebook, that can be a problem if we don't protect that data. That data that our tax dollars have gone into creating. So we have an obligation to the public, we have an obligation to those who created the work and are still working on the work. And we have an obligation to to humanity to produce it as cleanly and quickly as possible.
What is the role of technology in scholarly communication?
It facilitates that. In its best, it facilitates something more than what a group of humans would do without it, right? So if you were to put a group of researchers in the room with a group of people who need the research, whether they're other researchers, clinicians, patients, the public, what have you, the last thing they would do is follow this process with the crumpled piece of paper. What they would do instead was have a conversation, because that's what we do. This is what we're doing right now. It's the most expedient way to exchange information. And so I think at its best, technology can facilitate the kind of conversation you'd have if those researchers were directly addressing the people who need that research.
So technology is a facilitator.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And at its best, it performs that function in the way that humans can do it best. It creates the conversation, it creates the dialogue, but it does it in a way that tracks it and archives it and makes it available to others who weren't able to be in that virtual room. And it does it in a way that keeps it for a long time and maybe even allows it to take context in the larger picture.
But do you think that technology is an essential element?
Yes, at this point in our lives, it is an essential element because you don't have a room big enough for all of the people to talk to all of the people. So technology has become the room, right? The internet has become the room in which we are conversing on a daily basis. And so yes, we absolutely need the technology. The challenge that's happened in scholarly communication is it hasn't kept up. So I was around back when the web was young and when the research communication process started to move to a digital age. And what happened was scholarly communication took a divergent path from the rest of the web. It decided that it was special and it should do things in its own way because this work was so important. And so it took formats and standards and path processes and tools that the rest of the web wasn't using and made them part of the scholarly communication pipeline. And then it never changed. And the rest of the web moved on with lightning speed into a new era and a new era and a new era. And scholarly communication is over here publishing like it's 1999.
What are your ideas or hopes for the future of open science?
My hope is that we get off of our rear ends and create a real movement and stop arguing amongst ourselves about what open science is and whether it's open science or open scholarship or open something else, and actually get to the business of creating real change. And to do that, we have to form a real movement. We actually have to organize ourselves. We have to give up some of the rough edges in between our work and collaborate much more effectively and seamlessly. We have to consolidate behind common goals. And so I think that the time is right to actually make an open science movement occur and to put a lot more muscle behind that than we've been able to do in the past.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. It's been really a pleasure.
My pleasure.